This recording will cover Chapter 2 in your textbook, Approaches to Learning and Teaching. So kind of backing up and looking at, where our students might be. How can we best teach them? How are they going to learn? So you want to think about these learning outcomes, explain applied behavioral analysis, how teachers can use it in classrooms to increase desirable behaviors and decrease undesirable behaviors. That's really excuse me, that's really our goal, is to increase those desirable behaviors, the behaviors we want to see, and then decrease those behaviors we do not want to see. We're also going to talk about cognitive strategy instruction. Apparently I just made up a word, CSI, but not like crime scene investigation, to teach academic, cognitive, and social skills, and describe how social learning practices, executive functioning, and all of those practices that might influence both executive processing and academic outcomes. So the first thing we want to talk about is applied behavioral analysis, or applied behavior analysis, ABA. I was actually taking some ABA courses here for a while as part of a non-degree program. So, but it's really, if you're not familiar with ABA, it's really research based. There's a lot of research out there that shows how successful using the principles, of ABA are with students with disabilities. So it's a very scientific approach. It's very it's not scripted, but it's very scientific, for lack of I was trying to come up with a better word, but I don't have one right now. So we want to identify observable behaviors, right? Like define, observe the behaviors, and then we want to think about how we can manipulate antecedents, or what happens first, and consequences to change behavior. So if you think about, you're probably familiar with an ABC chart, or an ABC terminology, which stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So the antecedent is an event or stimulus that precedes a behavior. So what happened immediately before the behavior you saw? And not always talking about negative behaviors, right? If you see a desirable behavior, well, what happened directly before that behavior, so that the consequence, then the ABC, can be a positive consequence, so that you'll see that behavior again. So, you know, antecedent behavior and consequences are not always negative, right? We want to think about those observable and desirable behaviors that we want. Okay, here's the behavior that we just saw it. What did we, or what did they do right before? What was the antecedent? And then what was our response? What was the consequence? A consequence is not always negative, so keep that in mind, okay? So what can we do? Well, we as the teachers, so really you, not me, right? You can manipulate antecedents to influence behavior. So you have control over some of these things. You can alter the instruction, longer, shorter, easier, harder, student choices, whatever works for your student. Um, Sorry, I just saw my friend's nephew walking by the window. That was kind of funny. I tried to knock. He didn't hear me. So, but what can you do? Can you make the instructions shorter bursts of that explicit instruction? Give them some choices. Can you maintain a predictable class schedule, right? Limiting those new antecedents. If students know, what's expected of them and what's going to happen before the behavior that they are expected to show you, they're going to be more apt to follow that rule, or that expectation, and to show you that behavior. How can you create classroom rules to promote positive atmosphere? Not all the things you cannot do, but what about the things the students can do in positive ways? Arrange classroom to promote learning and positive behavior. You can control, to some extent, how you arrange a classroom. Yes, you cannot control things like doors and windows and sinks and cabinets, but how can you arrange the desks, or the learning centers, or the, whatever else you have, the whole group instruction area, whatever you're provided with in your classroom? How can you arrange that to promote learning and positive behavior? And how can you facilitate productive peer interactions? Because so much learning, and think about back what we talked about in Chapter 1, inclusion, successful inclusion. It really is a lot of productive peer interactions, but you might have to, especially with the younger students, you might have to facilitate explicitly some of those interactions. Okay, so we also want to think about, again, how we can increase desirable behaviors through consequences. Not always bad, right? Consequences, everyone thinks they're bad. They're not always bad. What if, the student performs the behavior you want, and then the consequence is that they get 5 minutes extra of computer time? Well, that's a good thing, right? So then next time you ask for that same behavior and the antecedent's the same, you ask for that same behavior, they're probably going to exhibit that behavior because they want that positive consequence, right? Think about, dogs and animals and when you give them treats, they're probably going to do the same thing next time because they want that consequence of a treat or a belly rub or whatever. That would be my dog. So thinking about that, thinking about how we can maintain or increase behavior, those desirable behaviors, while the student must already be able to exhibit the behavior, the consequence must follow the precise behavior. So in this case, we're looking to change a behavior. I think I said desirable, and I think that was a lie up here. I'm sorry. Reinforcer is whatever follows the behavior and maintains it. And then most powerful when reinforcement immediately follows the behavior. So if your student does something at 8:30 in the morning and you say, okay, at the end of the day, I'm going to give you, a treat, going back to my dog, of course, they're not going to remember what it was for. They're not going to know what at 2 o'clock if you give them something, you're like, oh, this is for what you did at 8:30. They're going to be like, oh, great, I showed up to school. I don't remember what I did. Same thing with animals, right? They don't know. You got to give them the treat like right away. I'm working on brushing my teeth with my dog. She does not like it. So as soon as I do it, I give her a treat and I tell her, I brushed your teeth and now you're going to get a treat. So I relate a lot of theories of learning to my dog. Thank you very much. So reinforcement is the most significant way to increase desirable academic or social behaviors. Can be used either way. So positive, is really that presentation of a stimulus to increase desired behavior, such as objects, food, social rewards, activities a student like, stuff like that. Negative is not bad, okay? So think about this. Negative reinforcement is not bad. It's the removal of something unpleasant to increase a desired behavior. Okay, so this is the example my friend always used to use at Penn State when I co-taught with her. We were talking about, if you get into a car now, especially the newer cars, what happens if you don't put your seatbelt on? It beeps, right? Most cars beep or they make some kind of annoying, unpleasant behavior or sound, right? So then what do? Typically, you'll put your seatbelt on. And then what happens? The beeping stops. So guess what you're going to do the next time you get in your car? You're going to turn the car on. It's going to beep for a second. Oh, automatically you're going to put your seatbelt on because you don't want to hear that annoying sound. So that is negative reinforcement. It's removing that unpleasant stimulus, right? Ultimately, we want people to wear their seatbelt, right? So they're safe. So that's the desired behavior. So if we remove that negative, that beeping and that unpleasant, oh, put your seatbelt on, danger, danger, it's going to increase the likelihood that that desired behavior will be replaced. Okay, so I want you to take some time in the textbook, either the e-text or the hard copy. There are a bunch of in every chapter that say apply the concepts. So I want you to take a few minutes, look through some of these as you're reading the chapter. Here are some examples of some reinforcers internal to extrinsic, or excuse me, internal to extrinsic, concrete or tangible. Something like self-managed reinforcers. Oh, you give yourself a check for raising your hand, stars for not fighting at lunch, charting behavior, stuff like that, to the more concrete, tangible items such as rewards, food, tickets, materials, raisins, crackers, whatever, pencils, paper, ticket tokens to exchange for toys or other items of value, stuff like that. So I think these apply the concepts. Sections in the textbook are really helpful, and hopefully you will take a few minutes to look at those. So some other reinforcers, some secondary reinforcers, shaping pre-MAC principle, and other contingencies. So secondary, again, these previously neutral behavior reinforcers. So things like teachers' praise, attention, they become reinforcers. So I want you to look at page 31 in your textbook. And for some reason, I was able to screenshot the top part of this page, not able to screenshot this bottom part. So just some other ways to say very good. And when you're saying something like very good, you want to be specific. What did they do very good at, right? So just again, take a few minutes and look through the textbook because I think there's some really helpful ideas in there. Pre-MAC principle, is kind of also some people call it like grandma's principle. An activity the student desired becomes contingent upon achieving a behavior that teacher specifies. Think about grandma. Okay, if you eat your green beans, then you get your chocolate cake kind of thing. So they do the one thing first and then they get kind of what they want. Group contingencies, contingency contracting, there are some examples of that in your textbook as well. And then we also want to think about decreasing undesirable behaviors through consequences. So we want to increase the desirable behaviors through consequences, right? Which in this case, the consequences are probably what? Positive. And if we want to decrease undesirable behaviors, the consequences might be a little more negative, right? Extinction. Well, we can ignore. So don't reinforce following an undesirable behavior. If you see something you don't want to see, just ignore it. Don't give attention, right? So that's kind of a negative consequence to that student. So we can decrease the undesirable behaviors. We also want to think about differential reinforcement, and this takes a number of, there's a variety of types of DR, differential reinforcement, and I'm going to show you page 34 in just one second. So you need to specifically identify the behavior that needs to change. You would want to focus, on one behavior at a time. You want to identify the desirable behavior. Okay, what do you want to see? You want to stop reinforcing interfering behavior or anything that's kind of getting in the way of them getting to that desirable behavior, and you want to reinforce the desirable behavior. All right, so let me show you what that means on page 34, and it takes a few seconds to get here. Okay, so on page 34, if you go down to the bottom, this is in the 10th edition too. Page 34 is in the 10th edition. So it talks about differential reinforcement, strengthening one set of responses in contrast to another. So it's an effective procedure for developing a positive behavior managed plan. And the main advantage is that positive consequences are used to reduce the strength of undesirable behavior. So therefore, negative side effects associated with punishment procedures are avoided. Punishment, we don't really want to use. Punishment, timeout, we'll get to those in just a second. So again, several forms of differential reinforcement. Okay, so one is, I keep having to move the screen. I'm sorry about that, y'all. All right, so differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors and alternate behaviors. So if there's incompatible behaviors, that's a behavior that cannot be happening at the same time as something else, right? So, if you're ignoring the out of seat behavior, then you are going to target what is incompatible with that, which in this case is when they're in their seat. So instead of, punishing or providing a negative consequence for being out of the seat, you want to provide a positive consequence or a reinforcer for being in the seat, because they can't do both behaviors at the same time, right? After you define what that means, in seat and out of seat behavior, they cannot be in their seat at the same time that they are out of their seat. Okay, so as soon as, our friend Scott is sitting in a seat, you want to catch it and reinforce that. You don't want to say, oh, I like how you're not out of your seat, Scott, right? You would say, Scott, great job being in your seat. Whatever you're going to say to them, reinforce, boom, boom. Then you're going to start intermittently reinforcing. So not every time, right? So Scott doesn't know when he's going to be reinforced. Okay, so the new response is selected because it represents an incompatible alternative to the disruptive behavior, right? So the two behaviors cannot happen at the same time. So if the student's undesirable behavior is saying, a very bad word, which I will not repeat here, then you train them to say, okay, fiddlesticks or something like that. Well, guess what? When they're saying fiddlesticks, they're not saying something bad. So reinforce that fiddlesticks, okay? I mean, I know it's kind of an old school word, but whatever, got to keep it PG. Okay, so then you also want to think about alternative behaviors. So the alternative behaviors are not necessarily incompatible, can occur at the same time as a disruptible behavior, but what you want to do with DRA is to strengthen a range of appropriate behaviors that the teacher will attend to naturally, which will reinforce a broad repertoire of appropriate behavior. Okay, so you want to read through that about the differences of DR incompatible and DR alternative behaviors. There's also DRO, differential reinforcement of other behaviors. So this is the reinforcement of the non-occurrence of the target behavior during a specified time period. And in this case is a behavior we're getting rid of. Reinforcers are delivered following time intervals when the target behavior does not occur. Okay, and so here's an example about some free time and how you can use differential reinforcement of other behaviors. I totally forgot what it stood for a second. So you want to identify the behavior that is to change, right? Your interfering behavior or your undesirable behavior. You want to identify the desirable behavior that is incompatible with the interfering behavior. Stop reinforcing the interfering behavior and reinforce the desirable behavior. All right, so keep that in mind. I'm going to stop here for part one, and we have some more slides, so come on back for part two, and I will get this situated where I want it. Okay, come back.